The congregation at Kirbyjon Caldwell's Megachurch in Houston believed they were following a man of God. For years, he stood behind the pulpit at the towering sanctuary of Windsor Village United Methodist Church, preaching faith, prosperity, uplift, community transformation. He had become a symbol of success, a voice within the African American religious world that bridged Capitol meetings, business circles, and Sunday worship. The name Caldwell signified influence, trust, and hope. He preached hope. He offered partnerships. He told believers that faith could change the world and that a rising church could change a city. But behind the smiling sermons and the gospel tours lay a different story. A story of enormous money, quiet deals, and eventually a fall. The trust of thousands would be betrayed, the hopes of many would be wounded, and the preacher would find himself in a federal courtroom, convicted, and sent to prison. The pulpit that once amplified his voice would be replaced with prison bars. The tale begins decades earlier. Kirbyjon Caldwell was born into a world of church and community. He grew up with Sunday services, church banquets, the power of faith as an anchor. He advanced, studied, gained credentials, and eventually became pastor of one of the most ambitious congregations in Houston. He oversaw the building of the massive Windsor Village campus. He launched programs, schools, and initiatives that gave hope to the inner city. His name became synonymous with faith-driven social uplift. Many saw his work as a bridge between the secular and the sacred, a preacher who moved in business and politics as well as religion. In sermons he spoke of redemption, faith's power to move mountains. In community luncheons, he mingled with city officials and business leaders. He was invited into the corridors of influence. He led prayers for governors and major events. The church he built seemed unstoppable, and the contributions poured in. The donations, the offerings, the hope of upward mobility for his members. Everyone believed they were investing in more than bricks and mortar. They were investing in a vision. Yet trouble had been quietly arranging itself. Unbeknown to many in his congregation, Caldwell had embarked on a financial journey beyond the sanctuary. He began raising funds from affluent investors, promising returns and backing by faith-based ventures. He described structures of ownership and investment tied to his reputation and church affiliation. The hustle of business merged with the pulpit in ways that rounded corners and obscured what was being promised. In effect, the preacher was offering opportunity, and investors were buying in. What they did not anticipate was the collapse of the deal. In 2019 and 2020, the law caught up. The U.S. government indicted him on charges of conspiracy to commit wire fraud. Investigators found that Caldwell had raised more than $5 million from investors by misrepresenting his own role and the risk of the investments. One news profile described how he paid more than $1 million in restitution before the indictment, a signal that problems were mounting. The shock for his followers was intense. Here was a man who had so publicly thrived on faith and integrity, now facing federal charges that declared exactly the opposite. Rumors swirled. Media coverage turned from uplifting to damning. Headlines asked, "How could a pastor fall so far? How could a man of God become a man of crime in the eyes of the law?" And the congregation, the donors, the city looked on, stunned. The investigation peeled back layers. Prosecutors documented investor presentations in which Caldwell portrayed himself as someone with unmatched access and influence, the kind of religious leader who could get buy-in because of his spiritual authority and business acumen. He promised one thing and delivered another. The money raised was used, in substantial part, not for the projects as advertised, but to repay earlier investors, to support failed ventures, or to prop up a facade. The wires moved. Investors lost trust. The legal net tightened. As the trial approached, the tension mounted. Friends of the church found themselves feeling betrayed. Staffers at the church whispered, "Did we know what was really going on?" Members who had given years of tithes asked, "Was this faith, or was this fraud?" The wider public wondered about the role of megachurch pastors in business and the blending of commerce and creed. Media analyzed how a man trusted to preach salvation could be trusted to mislead. The contrast between the sanctuary's warm lighting and the cold fluorescent offices of investigators was stark. In March 2020, the sentencing came. Kirbyjon Caldwell pled guilty, accepted the damage done, and was sentenced to 6 years in federal prison for conspiracy to commit wire fraud. He reported to a federal facility in Beaumont, Texas in June 2021. The pulpit had fallen silent. Inside the courtroom, he addressed the judge. His supporters sat in the back, their heads bowed. The prosecutor described how the man they trusted had used the halo of religion to enrich himself, and how the victims were not just investors but members of the same faith community. The judge looked at Caldwell's track record. Decades of service, yes, but also a betrayal of trust and a violation of the sacred role he held. The aftermath was complex. Keller, a former congregant, said that many members felt lost. If our pastor can do this, what can any of us believe? Others walked away entirely from the faith. Some stood by the church but demanded change. The Windsor Village community reeled. Donations dropped. Programs were canceled. The public image of the church shifted from powerhouse of hope to cautionary tale of hubris. Caldwell himself entered a new world, prison, from pulpit to cell block. He woke up and worked among inmates. His sermons were no longer in front of thousands under chandeliers, but maybe inside a chapel where the only audience was a handful of fellow inmates. He reflected on his decisions, the allure of power, the allure of money, the illusion of invulnerability. He thought back to the early days in the church when the calling was pure. He asked himself, when did it become about returns instead of redemption? When did I trade the gospel for gain? But his story did not end with the sentence. After his release, he returned to home confinement and then reintegration into the community. His identity changed from preacher-pastor to convicted felon. He had to reckon not only with the legal consequences but with the spiritual ones. How do you rebuild trust when you've broken yours? How do you preach integrity when you breached it? He spoke publicly about his journey from pulpit to prison and back, admitting the shame, but also claiming a desire to restore what he lost. The reflection that many in the community have drawn is haunting. Leaders hold power, yes, but with it, responsibility. The congregation trusted him, but trust is fragile. Money flows when people believe. Giving stops when faith wavers. And when a man who stood publicly as shepherd becomes a defendant in federal court, the damage ripples far beyond one church. It becomes a crisis of faith, a break in the social contract. Members ask, is the message of the ministry compromised? Is the institution corroded? Was the church a vehicle for God or for ambition? Behind the sermons, the lights, the praise band, and the Sunday crowds was a human being. A man fraught with desire, success, ego, ambition. The pulpit elevated him. His mistakes humbled him. The story serves as a warning. When the voice of God is overshadowed by the voice of my bank account, the house of faith risks crumbling. And yet the story also opens the door to redemption. Caldwell did not vanish into obscurity after prison. He spoke of accountability. He accepted restitution. He admitted wrongdoing. He asked for forgiveness. Whether the public will trust again or the church will rebuild remains an open question. For many, his name still echoes in sermons, but not as openly as before. The journey from pulpit to prison leaves scars. For the preacher, the investors, the faith community, and the public at large. Which brings us to the final chilling takeaway. We place faith in people, leaders, pastors, preachers, assuming that the title confers integrity. But human nature, with its temptations of money, power, acclaim, remains constant. The bigger the stage, the brighter the lights, the harder it is to resist the allure of the spotlight. When trust ends, the crime begins. For every worshiper, every donor, every believer, the question now becomes, who will they trust next, and on what basis? As the church doors reopened and the stained glass windows caught the morning light, the question lingered in the empty pews. Can a ministry be rebuilt after betrayal? Will the faithful return? Can the preacher who fell learn to serve without sinning? And for each listener, the deeper question remains, in the quiet of your own faith, are you worshiping a person or an ideal? Are you placing your trust in foundations that can crumble? Because faith is built on stone, yes, but people stand on stone and people fall. He stood before the congregation every Sunday morning, his voice rising in invitation, his arms outstretched in welcome, the bright lights of the sanctuary tracing the edge of his suit jacket, the polished wood pulpit gleaming under the stained glass windows. For years the minister had been celebrated, revered, consulted by city leaders, cited in media pieces about faith and success. His name had become synonymous with moral authority, spiritual uplift, a life of service. The faithful gave, tithes, offerings, trust. And he, pastor of one of the largest churches in his region, accepted it all, the smiles, the accolades, the expectation. He seemed the embodiment of what a man of God should be. But beneath the applause and the sermons lay a darker narrative. A story of ambition, of opportunities seized and promises made, of lines blurred between church and commerce. The narrative began in a modest home, a boy who grew up in Sunday school and youth group, memorizing verses and longing to preach. He studied theology, earned ministry credentials, and rose through the ranks of his denomination. His charisma, his knack for delivering message and meaning, opened doors. By his 40s, he was pastor of a megachurch campus, with multiple worship sites, youth programs, community outreach initiatives. He was praised for revitalizing neighborhoods, for bringing new hope to old blocks, for marrying business savvy with spiritual calling. In sermons, he told stories of transformation, of broken lives redeemed, of lost souls found, of neighborhoods changed by the power of faith. In media interviews, he was asked about leadership, about how to build a church that matters in the community. He spoke of trust, integrity, giving, and placing hope above fear. He seemed to live what he preached. The stage was set for greatness, and for something far more human than grace. One Sunday afternoon after the service, a hushed conversation began. A church board member asked questions. Why were certain funds moved from the outreach account into investment ventures? What were the returns promised? Why did a sizable donation from an elderly congregant end up being used for property purchases not listed in the church's annual report? At first it seemed like concern over bookkeeping, or perhaps a misunderstanding of ministry finance. But then the questions multiplied. Former staff members whispered about meetings in boardrooms where financial presentations seemed more like sales pitches. Investors, some of them older church members, were told their funds would yield above-market returns, tied to real estate deals, developments, faith-based opportunities. Investors trusted the pastor because he was the pastor. The congregation trusted his word, his calling, his suit and tie, his presence at civic events. But somewhere in that trust, the equation shifted, from spiritual guidance to financial promise. When federal agents arrived at his church offices one morning, the brightness of the facade contrasted sharply with the cold formality of investigators frisking through documents, tracing wires, questioning staff under oath. The investigation revealed a scheme in which the pastor and associates had solicited funds from congregants and external investors under the guise of a faith-based venture, property acquisitions, bond purchases, promises of large returns, assurances of stewardship. These were not small-time offerings. The amounts ran into the millions. Many targeted were older, trusting church members, people who believed the ministry would protect their gifts. But what the investigation found was different. Deposits diverted. Funds shifted to personal accounts. Investments that never fully materialized. Assurances given that were never fulfilled. Wire records, bank statements, emails, and brochures told a story of promises made, risk underplayed, trust abused. At trial, the prosecuting attorney described how the past-oriented institution of faith had been used as a platform for self-enrichment. He held out the badge of clergy. He held out the Sunday pulpit. And he used both to build belief until the believer became the victim. The record showed that one elderly woman had been convinced to invest her retirement savings into the fund the pastor described as God-driven, purpose-driven, return-driven. Another family had been told that the church's charity arm would partner with a property developer and share profits with investor members. Instead, their funds were used to pay earlier investors or to cover expenses that the pastor said were ministry needs. Questions of theology got swept away by spreadsheets, sermons replaced by pitch decks. The tension mounted as the courtroom aired recordings of board meetings, voicemails from uneasy staff, email threads where one investor asked, "What is the status of the land purchase? What is our payout schedule?" The pastor, who in previous years had stood confidently before his flock, assured them God will provide, now sat in a federal courtroom wearing a dark blue suit, his tie slightly askew, his eyes downcast. The judge detailed the betrayal of trust, that this was not simply a business failure, but a moral wrong, one compounded by the fact the victims were members of his own community, his own congregation, people who believed him to be a shepherd. The sentencing revealed the numbers: millions lost, restitution ordered, years in federal prison. The pulpit that once seemed unshakable had been replaced by the courtroom transcript, the heavy gavel, the lawyer's motions. In the aftermath, the church's doors remained open, but the energy had changed. Some members left, their trust broken, their faith shaken. Others stayed, hoping for reform, hoping their pastor had genuinely repented. The Board of Trustees held emergency meetings. The outreach programs were scaled back. Donations slowed. In the neighborhood, the news spread. The local paper ran front-page exposés. Civic leaders, once proud to stand with the pastor at ribbon cuttings and city events, now kept their distance. The reputation of the church, once thriving, now bore a stain. The disappointed, the angry, the quietly wounded, former congregants, investors, community members sought answers. Some filed lawsuits. Some simply stopped attending. The sermon halls echoed with emptiness, trust replaced by caution. Meanwhile, the ex-pastor served his term in federal prison. No longer delivering sermons to thousands, he faced the monotony and harshness of incarceration. He watched his reputation disintegrate, confronted his decisions, and asked himself the questions he once asked his congregation. When did faith become finance? When did ministry become machine? When did the shepherd trade his forge for ledger books? He wrote apologies, some to congregation members, some to investors, some to his church. Some said they accepted them. Others said forgiveness must be earned, not promised. Upon release, he returned to his city, to the very church he once led. The welcome was mixed. Some embraced him as a fallen leader redeemed by accountability. Others saw so much damage that they could never trust him again in the pulpit. The sermons resumed, but the tone was different, less triumphant, more cautious. The audience no longer watched solely for inspiration. They watched as if expecting the crack in the facade. In community forums, they talked openly about the case, how the intersection of power, charisma, faith, and money had created the conditions for abuse. They asked whether the structure of ministry boards, oversight, transparency, needed reform. They worried that the same pattern could repeat in other contexts. The haunting takeaway lingered beyond the final Sunday service. We place our trust in people who wear titles, Reverend, pastor, bishop, assuming that those titles guarantee ethical behavior. We assume that faith communities are safe havens. We assume that spiritual calling equates to moral infallibility. And yet the truth delivered in court reminded us that titles don't exempt human weakness, ambition, vulnerability. The brighter the platform, the greater the temptation. In the quiet of the sanctuary after the last hymn, when the lights dim and the crowd disperses, one question still hangs in the empty pews. Is the foundation of trust built on the person or the principle? If we realize too late that the person has failed, does faith itself fracture or simply survive in new forms? The congregation once gathered under the phrase, "Where trust ends, the crime begins." Now they know exactly what that means, because trust did end, and the crime began. The summer of 1926 hung thick and airless over Fort Worth, Texas, inside the sprawling First Baptist Church. Ceiling fans turned lazily above a sea of pressed suits and Sunday hats. Every pew was filled. People came not only for salvation, but for the spectacle of their pastor, Reverend J. Norris, the man who could make the gospel sound like a courtroom summation and a political rally at once. He was 49 that year, tall, intense, his eyes pale and electric. When he spoke, his words cracked through the sanctuary like rifle shots. He called out corruption from the pulpit, naming local officials, businessmen, even other ministers. He ran his church like a crusade, his newspaper like an arsenal. Supporters adored him for his courage. Enemies despised him for his ferocity. He told his congregation he was God's soldier in a city crawling with sin. Fort Worth in those days was a boom town. Oil money, prohibition liquor, rail yards, neon lights. The same week Norris preached against vice. The papers carried stories of gambling raids and saloon shootings. It was a city at war with itself, and Norris positioned himself as its moral general. But the louder he thundered, the more enemies he made. Political bosses wanted him silenced. Rival pastors mocked his theatrics. And among his fiercest critics was a wealthy local lumberman named Dexter Elliott Chips, a man who believed Norris's crusade had crossed from religion into demagoguery. Chips was known around town as outspoken and impulsive, a man who didn't like being publicly condemned. In one of his editorials, Norris had accused city officials and their business allies of protecting vice. Chips took it personally. He confronted the pastor once before, warning him to keep his name out of the sermons. Norris ignored the warning and doubled down. The next encounter would not be civil. On a sweltering July 17th afternoon, the church offices were quiet except for the buzz of a single fan. Norris sat at his desk in the parsonage building behind the sanctuary, sorting correspondence and sermon notes. A secretary heard heavy footsteps in the hall. Chips entered without knocking. Witnesses later recalled voices rising almost instantly. Chips accused the pastor of slander, said he'd been made a laughingstock in the city. Norris told him he only spoke the truth. The argument grew louder, then explosive. Chips, red-faced, reached inside his coat. Norris, who kept a pistol in his desk drawer, later claimed he believed Chips was drawing a weapon. He pulled out his revolver and fired 3 times. The sound echoed through the corridors, shocking the secretaries and janitors who ran toward the office. Chips staggered backward, collapsed near the door, and died within minutes. The smell of gunpowder lingered above the mahogany desk, over the scattered sermon notes and the open Bible. Within the hour, the police arrived and arrested Reverend Norris for murder. News of the shooting spread across the South by evening editions. "Preacher kills prominent businessman," read one headline. Another, "Famed pastor claims self-defense." To the faithful, it was inconceivable. Their minister accused of murder. To his critics, it felt like vindication, proof that his crusade had always been edged with violence. The arrest triggered one of the most sensational trials in Texas history. Reporters poured into Fort Worth from Dallas, Houston, and even Chicago. The courthouse steps filled with spectators. Inside the jail, Norris sat calmly, reading his Bible, occasionally giving interviews through the bars. "I acted to save my life," he said. "I bear no malice toward the man, but a minister's life is sacred too." Public opinion split down the middle. Church members raised money for his defense, claiming he'd been threatened repeatedly. Opponents demanded justice, arguing no preacher should be above the law. The city's mood was electric. Revival meeting by night, murder trial by day. When the proceedings began in January 1927, the courtroom was standing room only. Norris entered wearing a black suit and carrying the same Bible he used in church. He nodded to his wife, Lillian, seated behind the defense table. The prosecutor laid out the case simply. An unarmed man had been shot 3 times in cold blood. Witnesses had seen no weapon in Chips's hands. The pastor, they argued, had been goaded by pride and anger. Norris's defense was just as direct. He claimed Chips had threatened him earlier that week, that the businessman had reached inside his coat as if to draw a gun. Fear, not fury, had guided his actions. The defense called church employees who testified they'd heard Chips shouting threats. Others described the pastor's long campaign against corruption, a man constantly receiving anonymous death notes. Outside the courthouse, street preachers shouted prayers for justice. Vendors sold souvenir postcards of the pastor's photograph. The trial became not only about a shooting, but about religion itself. Could a man of God also be capable of lethal violence? And if so, could he still claim divine protection? By the second week, testimony had painted two irreconcilable portraits, one of a reckless, arrogant minister intoxicated by power, another of a righteous crusader cornered by a furious adversary. Both sides waited for the jury to decide which version of the Reverend J. Norris they believed. The second week of testimony turned the courthouse into a theater. Every morning, lines of townspeople gathered before sunrise hoping to claim a seat inside. Women carried paper fans. Reporters perched along the aisles, pencils poised. The room smelled of dust and perfume and sweat. When Reverend Norris took the stand in his own defense, you could have heard a pin drop. He looked older than the man who had once thundered from the pulpit. His hands trembled slightly as he held the Bible. He spoke quietly at first, almost like he was preaching to himself. He said that Chips had stormed into his office shouting profanities, that he had reached inside his coat, and that in that instant Norris believed he was about to die. "I only did what any man would do," he told the jurors. "I did what I thought was necessary to preserve my life." The prosecutor's cross-examination was relentless. He asked why the minister had kept a pistol so conveniently within reach. "Was that God's protection or your own?" He sneered. Norris didn't flinch. He said he carried the weapon because of threats he'd received over the years. "You can't shepherd wolves without a staff," he replied. Some in the courtroom nodded. Others scoffed. Witness after witness was called. Church secretaries described hearing raised voices and gunshots, then seeing Chips's body sprawled in the doorway. None had seen a weapon in the victim's hands. Police officers testified that no firearm was found on or near the deceased. The prosecutor leaned heavily on that point. If Chips was unarmed, then the act could not be self-defense. The defense brought its own witnesses, men who swore they'd heard Chips boast about settling things with the pastor. A local grocer testified that Chips had bought a pistol a week before the shooting, though no such gun was ever recovered. The defense painted Chips as a volatile man driven by alcohol and wounded pride. They reminded the jury that threats against Norris were common. His sermons had targeted bootleggers, brothel owners, and politicians who all wanted him silenced. Each night, Fort Worth newspapers printed dramatic recaps. One headline read, "Bullets and Bible, which will jury believe?" Editorials divided along moral lines. Some praised Norris for defending his life against corruption. Others condemned him as a hypocrite who preached peace and practiced violence. When closing arguments began, the courthouse overflowed. The prosecutor rose first, pacing before the jury box. He described the slain businessman as a victim of ego, not violence. "This defendant hides behind his pulpit," he declared, using God's name to excuse his crime. He pointed directly at Norris. "No man, no preacher, no citizen is above the law." When he pulled that trigger, he ceased to be a minister and became a murderer. Then the defense stood. They spoke of the world Norris inhabited, death threats, late-night phone calls, anonymous letters promising revenge. "He faced danger every day because he dared to speak against evil," the lawyer said. "And when evil walked into his office that afternoon, he did what any man of conscience would do. He survived." He held up the pastor's Bible. "This is not the weapon that killed Dexter Chips," he said softly. "Fear did." The jury retired to deliberate. Outside, thousands waited in the summer heat. Hours passed. Then, just before dusk, the bailiff opened the doors. The jurors filed in, their faces unreadable. The clerk read the verdict, "Not guilty." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Some spectators applauded, others wept. Norris bowed his head, lips moving in silent prayer. The judge banged his gavel for order, but the sound was lost beneath the roar. The preacher who had stood accused of murder walked free. Reporters swarmed him on the courthouse steps. "Do you have any statement for the public, Reverend?" one asked. Norris lifted his eyes to the sky. "God has vindicated me," he said. "The truth has triumphed." The verdict electrified the city. To his supporters, it was proof of divine protection. To his enemies, a miscarriage of justice. Some claimed the jury had been swayed by faith and fame, not facts. But the law had spoken, and Norris was a free man. He returned to his church the following Sunday. Crowds overflowed the sanctuary. He stepped into the pulpit and let the applause wash over him. When the room fell silent, he opened his Bible to the book of Daniel, the story of the prophet delivered from the lion's den. "When the world condemns you for standing on the word of God," he said, "remember, the Lord delivers his own." The congregation rose to its feet. The organ thundered. For that moment, the scandal seemed almost holy. Yet behind the hymns, the controversy lingered. Families of both men avoided one another on city streets. Business partners of the slain man quietly cursed the verdict. The church's membership swelled, but so did its critics. Fort Worth's newspapers continued to publish editorials for weeks, debating whether justice or charisma had prevailed. In private, even some loyal parishioners admitted that something in their pastor had changed. The confidence that once seemed righteous now bordered on defiance. He spoke less of humility, more of destiny. The man who had stared down a murder trial began to see every challenge as another divine test he could not lose. In the months after the acquittal, Reverend J. Norris became a legend not just in Fort Worth, but across the South. His congregation swelled to record numbers. Sunday services turned into spectacles of redemption and defiance. The sanctuary packed wall to wall with worshipers who wanted to see the man who had faced the law and walked away free. He spoke of victory, not the kind won in courtrooms, but the kind ordained by God. "They said the shepherd would fall," he thundered one morning, "but the Lord lifted me up." To the faithful, he was a prophet. To others, he was a contradiction. A man of God with the heart of a politician and the temper of a soldier. With renewed fame came new ambition. Norris expanded his church's reach through radio broadcasts, revival tours, and printed sermons that circulated across the nation. He spoke against communism, Catholicism, and moral decay, often blending theology with fiery populism. His words resonated with many but alienated others. Critics accused him of using faith as a weapon and influence as currency. Meanwhile, the shadow of the trial never completely lifted. The family of Dexter Chips carried their grief quietly, but their bitterness became a silent fixture in the city's conscience. Chips's widow left Fort Worth, unable to walk past the church that had once condemned her husband in spirit long before the court acquitted his killer. By the 1930s, Norris's empire had grown vast. He founded schools, missions, and a new paper that promoted his brand of conservative Baptist revivalism. He was both admired and feared, the preacher who had killed a man and survived, the pastor whose voice could fill a tent of 10,000, or silence a critic with a single sermon. Yet behind his triumphs lay an unspoken exhaustion. The murder trial had not broken him, but it had hardened him. Friends recalled moments when he seemed haunted, lingering after services, staring at the pulpit as if seeing something no one else could. One assistant pastor once found him alone late at night in the church office, his hands trembling over the same desk where Chips had fallen years before. Norris didn't notice him enter. He was murmuring softly, the same words again and again. "I had no choice." In later years, as his influence spread to Detroit and beyond, his confrontational style led to new controversies, political battles, denominational splits, public feuds. He seemed drawn to conflict, as if it were the only way to reaffirm his sense of divine calling. Yet each fight left another scar on his reputation. He died in 1952 while preaching in Florida, not in disgrace, but not in peace either. The papers called him the most controversial preacher of the American pulpit. His funeral drew thousands. Old rivals stayed away, but his followers filled the church, singing hymns of victory and deliverance. They buried him in Fort Worth, beneath a headstone that bore only his name and the words, "He fought the good fight." But what fight had it really been? For decades afterward, theologians, journalists, and historians debated that question. Some said Norris had embodied the contradictions of American religion, moral certainty welded to human pride. Others saw him as a tragic warning that power, once justified as divine, can make a man believe he's untouchable. The office where the shooting happened was eventually remodeled, the bullet holes plastered over, the furniture replaced. Yet older church members whispered that on quiet nights the walls seemed to remember. They said that if you stood there long enough you could almost hear the echo of two men arguing. A flash of anger, the crack of a gun, then silence. It was perhaps fitting that Norris's legacy refused to rest easily. His story lived on in sermons about redemption and in lectures about corruption. Every generation found something new in it, courage or hypocrisy, conviction or delusion. A century later, the case remains one of the strangest intersections of faith and violence in American history. A preacher who carried both a Bible and a gun, a man whose pulpit led not to salvation, but to the courtroom. When you strip away the legend, you're left with a haunting question, one that has no easy answer. Can a man claim to serve God and still draw a gun in his name? It's the kind of question that lingers long after the sermon ends. He called it River Ministries, a name that shimmered with promise. To the people of Meridian Falls, a quiet town just outside Atlanta, Pastor Daniel Mercer was the closest thing to a celebrity they had ever known. His voice filled radios, his smile lit up billboards, and his sermons drew thousands to the converted warehouse that served as both sanctuary and spectacle. They said his words could make a sinner weep and a skeptic believe. He was tall, well-dressed, and always wore a gleaming silver cross that seemed to catch the light just right when he lifted his hands to pray. To his congregation, he wasn't just a preacher. He was proof that faith could look like success. It began small, as most empires do. A rented storefront, 20 folding chairs, and a handful of worshipers who believed in his vision. He preached about redemption, about second chances, about how God didn't just want to save souls, he wanted to bless them. Within a year, the church had grown into hundreds, within 5,000s. By the time Grace River opened its 4,000-seat campus on the outskirts of town, Mercer was already a regional phenomenon. His sermons were broadcast on cable access, then syndicated online. He wrote books, glossy hardcovers with photos of him on the cover, titles like Faith in the Fast Lane and Divine Prosperity. His message was simple. If you gave to God, God would give back. And when people saw how Mercer lived, the custom suits, the mansion on the hill, the sleek black Mercedes, they believed him. After all, wasn't he living proof of divine favor? The donations poured in. Tithes, love offerings, special building funds. He told his followers that every dollar was a seed of faith. Planted in God's soil, he'd say, and watch your blessings multiply. But inside the church's financial office, the soil was rotting. It started with small things, expense reimbursements without receipts, ministry credit cards used for business trips that always seemed to end at luxury resorts. The staff accountant, a quiet woman named Leah, began to notice patterns. Large transfers to shell companies, checks written to names that didn't appear on payroll. When she brought it up, Mercer smiled and told her not to worry. God's work doesn't always look tidy on paper, he said. Sometimes you just have to trust the vision. Leah didn't press further. No one did. At Grace River, questioning the pastor was like questioning God himself. Then came the expansion. Mercer announced plans to build a second campus in Nashville, a $12 million project that he promised would bring revival to the nation. He launched the River Rising campaign, urging followers to give sacrificially. Families emptied savings accounts. One elderly widow sold her home and donated the proceeds. Mercer's charisma was relentless. He could make guilt sound like destiny. Behind closed doors, the money flowed not to construction firms, but to offshore accounts. Mercer had found a partner in a smooth-talking financial consultant named Brett Lowell, who specialized in faith-based asset management. Together, they siphoned millions from church accounts into investment fronts, real estate deals, private jets, and foreign accounts masked by scripture-sounding LLCs. For years, it worked. The church grew louder, richer, flashier. Mercer began traveling with a personal security team. He told his flock it was necessary because of threats, though none were ever reported. He called himself a shepherd under siege. But greed doesn't age well. In late 2018, a young journalist from a local paper started asking questions. Her name was Emily Carter, a religion correspondent barely out of college. She'd attended one of Mercer's services while covering a feature on megachurch growth. What caught her eye wasn't the message, it was the money. Ushers passed buckets 3 times in 1 hour, and the donation screens kept looping a graphic that read, "Text to bless, every dollar is a miracle." When she asked for financial transparency, her requests were ignored. So she dug deeper: tax records, property filings, nonprofit disclosures. What she found didn't add up. Mercer's personal real estate holdings had quadrupled in 4 years, yet Grace River's charitable expenditures had dropped by nearly half. Her article hit like a thunderclap. Grace or greed? Questions surround Pastor Mercer's empire. The story went viral overnight. Mercer called it a spiritual attack, denouncing the journalist from his pulpit as a tool of darkness. The congregation erupted in applause, but beneath the cheers, something in the air had shifted. Doubt, quiet, dangerous, and contagious, had entered the sanctuary. Then, 1 month later, the FBI arrived. The raid took place on a Sunday morning, just as Mercer was beginning his sermon. Agents in plain clothes moved through the crowd quietly, serving warrants, seizing financial records, escorting the pastor out a side door. The congregation sat in stunned silence. For a moment they thought it was part of the message, until they saw the handcuffs. The charges, wire fraud, money laundering, and embezzlement exceeding $8, $3 million. As the details emerged, the illusion shattered. The lavish cars and private jet were purchased with donation funds. The Nashville campus didn't exist. The land Mercer had claimed to buy was a vacant lot owned by one of his shell companies. Even the church's humanitarian outreach photos had been staged with hired actors. When the trial began, Mercer pleaded not guilty. His defense team argued that he'd simply mismanaged funds, that he'd been overzealous in ministry, not criminal in intent. But prosecutors painted a far darker picture, a man who built a kingdom of faith only to plunder it from within. Witnesses described meetings where Mercer boasted of being too anointed to fail. Others recounted being pressured to donate under spiritual threat, told that withholding their tithe was robbing God. The widow who'd sold her home testified through tears. She said Mercer had promised her a divine return, that her sacrifice would build God's house. "I just didn't know," she said, "that I was buying his." The verdict came after 3 weeks of testimony, guilty on all counts. When the judge asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, Mercer looked up, calm, polished, still wearing his silver cross. "I may have fallen short of men's laws," he said, "but I've never fallen short of God's grace." He was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. Grace River closed within months. The Grand Sanctuary was sold to a logistics company. The neon sign that once read, "Believe Big," was taken down and left to rust in a storage yard. From his prison cell, Mercer continued to write newsletters, devotionals, even a book titled Faith Behind Bars. He signed each letter with the same phrase he'd once used in his sermons: "The vision lives on." But the people of Meridian Falls moved on without him. Some joined smaller churches. Others abandoned religion altogether. The widow who'd lost her home now lived with her daughter in another town. She kept one of Mercer's old books on a shelf, not as a reminder of faith, but as a warning. Years later, when Emily Carter was interviewed about the story that started it all, she said something that stayed with viewers. Pastor Mercer's greatest sermon wasn't the one he preached from the pulpit. It was the one his life became, about how power, when sanctified by belief, can justify anything. Mercer will be eligible for parole in 2034. His supporters still send him letters, convinced of his innocence. His detractors call him a symbol of corruption. But the truth, as always, lies somewhere in between, in that murky place where faith and ambition blur, and the man who once promised blessings ends up praying for forgiveness behind locked doors. Because in the end, the story of Daniel Mercer isn't about money or miracles. It's about the moment when a man stops listening to God and starts believing he is him. And when that happens, there's only one place left to go, from pulpit to prison. They called him Pastor Jonah, though his full name was Jonah Whitmore, and for most of his life, he believed God had chosen him to save people. For years in the small Kentucky town of Haven Ridge, he did exactly that, or so it seemed. The church he founded, Redeemer's Light Tabernacle, started in an abandoned barn with 20 members and a dream. Whitmore was young, handsome, magnetic. He had a voice that could shake a room and a way of speaking that made ordinary people feel extraordinary. To the weary, he promised healing. To the poor, he promised hope. To everyone, he promised truth, but it was his truth, not God's. He preached about spiritual warfare, about a world corrupted by demons and faithless men. His sermons grew darker with time, his tone more urgent. "Evil walks among us," he'd say, pacing the stage. And sometimes the devil doesn't wear horns. He wears a smile. People loved him for it. Fear, after all, is a kind of faith. By 2011, Redeemer's Light had over 1,000 members. The church compound sprawled across 10 acres, a chapel, dormitories, and a gated perimeter. Whitmore said it was to keep temptation out, but in truth it kept everyone else away. He controlled everything: what people wore, what music they listened to, who they married, even what they ate. He said the world outside was poisoned by sin, that only those who lived within the walls were truly chosen. He called his followers the flock. They gave him everything: money, labor, loyalty. Women were told it was their duty to serve the pastor as a vessel of God's anointing. Men were taught to obey him without question. He convinced them that questioning him was the same as questioning the Almighty. And for years no one did. Then came Sarah Lowe. She joined the church in 2013, a single mother of 2 looking for stability. Whitmore took her under his wing. He told her she was special, that he saw a light in her that others couldn't. Soon he made her his assistant, then his spiritual confidant. Rumors spread. Whispered doubts about the time she spent alone in his office, the locked doors, the nights she didn't return home. One evening, during a midweek prayer meeting, Sarah stood up in front of the congregation and began to speak. Her hands shook. Her voice trembled. "Pastor Jonah isn't who you think he is," she said. The room froze. She said he had lied, that he had used his position to manipulate and harm. The gasps turned to murmurs. Whitmore stood motionless at first, then walked slowly toward her. "You're not yourself, Sarah," he said, voice calm. "The enemy's got hold of your heart." She shook her head. "No," she said. "You're the enemy." He smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes, and told 2 of his deacons to escort her out. That night, Sarah and her children disappeared. Whitmore told the congregation she'd gone back to her old life of sin, that the devil had reclaimed her. He asked the church to pray for her soul. They did. But 3 months later, her car was found submerged in a creek 6 miles from the compound. The driver's door was open. Inside were a child's shoe, a Bible, and a blood-stained scarf. Sarah's body was never found. For the first time, cracks appeared in the church's armor. Members began whispering, questioning. Whitmore countered every doubt with fire. His sermons became more apocalyptic, his rhetoric more violent. "God is testing us," he told them. "The world is trying to destroy his chosen. We cannot falter." But the outside world was closing in. Detective Eli Sanders of the Kentucky State Police had been following the church for months, ever since reports of missing persons and financial irregularities started to overlap. When Sarah's car was pulled from the water, he began connecting dots: bank withdrawals, witness statements, property deeds in Whitmore's name. A warrant was issued to search the compound. On the morning of October 18, 2014, police vehicles rolled up to Redeemer's Light. Members stood at the gates praying and chanting. Whitmore emerged in a white robe, Bible in hand. He shouted that they had no authority there. Officers entered anyway. Inside the main office, they found firearms, stacks of cash, and sealed envelopes labeled Emergency Exodus Fund. In a locked storage room beneath the sanctuary, they discovered something else: a burial pit freshly filled. The forensics team unearthed remains later confirmed to belong to Sarah Lowe and one of her children. The news broke like wildfire. The same man who had baptized half the county was now accused of murder. Whitmore was arrested that afternoon. As officers led him away, his congregation cried and screamed, some collapsing to their knees. He looked up at the sky and whispered, "They'll crucify me like they did him." At trial, the evidence was overwhelming. DNA linked him to the scene. Financial records revealed massive fraud. Witnesses, former members, testified to years of control, psychological abuse, and threats of divine punishment. One man recounted being told that disobedience would make his soul rot before his body did. Whitmore's defense claimed the deaths were accidental, that Sarah had taken her own life and her child's in despair. But the prosecution had a different story: a man whose ego had metastasized into delusion, who believed that killing a doubter was purifying the flock. He was convicted of 2 counts of murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Even after sentencing, he refused to admit guilt. In his final sermon before incarceration, recorded secretly by a visitor, he said, "The world may lock my body away, but my spirit is untouchable." You can't imprison God's chosen. His followers fractured. Some left and rebuilt their lives. Others continued to write him letters, sending money to a prison ministry fund. They said they still felt his presence when they prayed. Years later, Detective Sanders was asked what he remembered most about the case. He didn't mention the evidence or the trial. Only the first time he looked Whitmore in the eyes. "I've seen killers before," he said. "But this one truly believed God would forgive him because he never thought he was wrong." Today, the land where Redeemer's Light once stood is overgrown. The chapel is gone, demolished after the conviction. Locals say no one wants to build there, that the ground feels heavy. At night, if you drive past, you can still see the old signpost, the words barely visible beneath rust and rain. The light still shines. But it doesn't, not anymore. Because in the story of Jonah Whitmore, the light became something else: obsession masquerading as faith, violence disguised as righteousness. And in the end, that's what sent him from pulpit to prison. They called themselves the Ash Grove Communion, a quiet congregation tucked into the damp pines of northern Arkansas, miles from the nearest town. To the handful of families who moved there in the mid-1980s, it was supposed to be a sanctuary from a world they believed had lost its soul. The man who convinced them of that was Pastor Caleb Rourke, a preacher with a smile so calm it made you forget to breathe. Rourke had once been a traveling revivalist. He preached in tents behind supermarkets, promising healing, forgiveness, and a second Eden for those who truly believed. By 1983, he said the Lord had given him a new command: to build the garden again. The land he purchased had once been a lumber camp. He renamed it Ash Grove, after the trees that had burned there in a forest fire years before. He told his followers that from ash came purity. In the beginning, nothing seemed dangerous. Families built cabins, planted vegetables, and gathered in a rough wooden chapel Rourke called the Hall of the Covenant. Children were taught scripture by lantern light. Adults worked the fields and turned their paychecks over to the church. Money corrupts, Rourke said, so let the church handle it. It was small sacrifices at first, selling cars, giving up television, mailing letters only through the commune office. Rourke's sermons grew longer, quieter, stranger. He spoke of purification by flame, of the world's end, of a day when the faithful would be lifted through fire into light. When one family tried to leave, he warned the others that doubt was the first spark of damnation. Within a month, no one mentioned the family's name again. By 1986, the commune had nearly 80 members. Outsiders called it a cult, but the sheriff's office found no crimes, just people who didn't want to talk. Rourke registered the church as a nonprofit, filed every tax form correctly, and appeared polite whenever officials visited. He always offered pie and prayer. Behind closed doors, however, discipline had become ritual. Members were made to stand for hours in front of the chapel's iron stove, confessing sins until Rourke believed they had been cleansed by heat. He called it the trial of ash. The first real sign that something had gone terribly wrong came in February 1987, when a young woman named Lydia Marin was taken to the county hospital with burns on her arms and back. She told doctors she'd fallen asleep near the stove. When police asked to speak with her again, she'd disappeared, signed out against medical advice, the nurse said, escorted by two men in plain suits who claimed to be her cousins. Her car was later found abandoned on a gravel road leading back to Ash Grove. Inside the commune, Rourke began teaching that the world had ended spiritually, and only those who walked through flame could live again. He drew diagrams on chalkboards, circles within circles, numbers that matched passages in Revelation. He rationed food, insisting fasting purified the soul. Those who questioned him were sent to prayer, locked for days in a dark storage shed with only water and scripture. By autumn, a few members managed to flee. They told deputies about strange midnight gatherings where Rourke made them burn their old belongings, clothes, photos, even marriage licenses, claiming earthly attachments trapped the soul. Their accounts sounded delusional, conflicting, impossible to prove. No warrants were issued. In rural Arkansas, a man could run his church however he pleased. Everything changed on March 12, 1988. A fire tore through the Ash Grove compound before dawn. It burned fast, feeding on dry timber and kerosene stored for lamps. When firefighters arrived, the chapel was a wall of flame. 23 people were found dead inside, many in a circle around the pulpit. Among them was Caleb Rourke, seated upright in a chair, Bible open on his lap. His fingerprints were on a 5-gallon fuel can. The county coroner ruled it a murder-suicide, but not everybody matched the membership list. 3 children the survivors swore had been there were never found. Some said Rourke had sent them away before the fire to spread the word. Others believed they perished unseen, consumed completely by the blaze. The truth vanished with the smoke. In the months that followed, investigators pieced together bank records, letters, and tape recordings Rourke had made for his inner circle. He spoke calmly about releasing souls through the flame, a perverse reinterpretation of baptism. The district attorney called it mass homicide wrapped in theology. Survivors called it deliverance gone mad. Reporters flooded the area. Documentaries followed. The Ash Grove Communion joined the long American list of rural utopias turned infernos. And yet, for those who had lived there, the most haunting question wasn't why Rourke did it, but why they believed he could save them at all. Years later, the site remains fenced off, overgrown with vines and charred beams. Every November, someone leaves a single Bible on the stone steps of the chapel ruins. Its pages are always turned to Isaiah 61:3. To give unto them beauty for ashes. When dawn broke over what had been Ash Grove, the smell of burning pine still hung thick in the valley. Sheriff's deputies set up tape around the perimeter, their boots sinking into the soft, blackened earth. It was quiet except for the hiss of water soaking embers and the static of radio chatter. Every officer who walked through the remains of the chapel said the same thing later. It didn't look like chaos. It looked arranged. The bodies weren't scattered. They sat upright, many holding hands, faces turned toward the pulpit where Rourke's chair still stood. The sheriff found a small cassette recorder near his feet. When played, it contained only one thing: Rourke's voice reading the book of Malachi, slow and even, until midway through chapter 4. The tape melted into silence right before the line, "For behold, the day cometh that shall burn as an oven." At first, authorities assumed mass suicide. But within a week, the state fire marshal's report shifted the tone. There were traces of accelerant poured in deliberate trails from the pulpit outward. Many of the victims had inhaled smoke. They were alive when the fire began. The conclusion was horrifyingly simple. Someone started the fire while the congregation was still inside. 3 survivors were found wandering the woods nearby: Ellen Shaw, David Lorne, and a teenage boy named Micah Harper. All bore burns, dehydration, and signs of prolonged confinement. Ellen was the first to speak. She told investigators that the fire wasn't spontaneous, it was commanded. "He said it was time to enter the fire," she whispered. "He said the Lord would walk among the flames and find only the pure." Her voice trembled as she described the final sermon. Rourke had stood in the chapel holding a steel bucket of ash. He marked each forehead with it, murmuring a prayer she could barely hear. Then he ordered the doors barred from the inside. He said, "We've been waiting for the trumpet too long. It's time we blow it ourselves." Ellen and David managed to pry open a side window when the flames reached the rafters. They dragged Micah through the gap and ran barefoot into the woods. Behind them, she said, the fire sounded like thunder. They weren't screaming, she recalled. They were singing. The investigation uncovered years of meticulous planning. Rourke had emptied church accounts weeks earlier, converting money to gold coins buried in mason jars on the property. He'd ordered bulk shipments of lamp oil and kerosene labeled as donations for winter heat. His journals revealed a fixation with cleansing rituals, a belief that humanity had already died spiritually, and that only through literal fire could the soul become light. It was methodical, theological madness. Forensic teams found small bones near the edge of the property, animals, possibly dogs. But among them was a fragment that didn't match. The medical examiner believed it belonged to a child under 10. That single discovery reclassified the case from mass suicide to mass murder. The missing children from the membership list were presumed dead. In nearby towns, the story took over every newspaper. "Preacher of Fire," one headline called him. Locals came forward with their own memories of Rourke. A man who'd once preached at revivals, polite and magnetic, who could make scripture sound like poetry. No one could explain how that same man had come to orchestrate one of the most chilling communal deaths in state history. Months turned into years. Survivors tried to rebuild their lives, but the world outside didn't make sense to them anymore. Ellen moved to Missouri and later wrote a memoir called Through the Flame, trying to make peace with what she'd endured. David never spoke publicly again. As for Micah, he vanished from records altogether. Some said he changed his name. Others claimed he returned to the site every year on the fire's anniversary. In 1993, a film crew revisited Ash Grove for a documentary. They found the chapel's foundation overgrown, its stones covered in moss. But inside the rubble, they discovered something strange: the charred remains of another recorder. When restored, it played a man's voice whispering faintly over the hiss of static. "If the world will not burn for him, then we will." Experts later confirmed it was Rourke's. The audio ended with a child's voice asking, "When do we wake up?" No one ever determined exactly when Rourke lost the line between faith and delusion. Psychologists who studied the tapes said his writings showed patterns of messianic narcissism, the belief that one's suffering redeems others. But for those who lost family in that fire, explanations meant nothing. Their loved ones weren't symbols or data points. They were people who just wanted to believe in something bigger than themselves. The county eventually bulldozed the ruins, yet every autumn, locals swear they see faint lights moving through the trees at night, pale flickers like candles, drifting near the spot where the chapel once stood. No one goes close. The land is still marked as private property, though no owner has claimed it in decades. In the end, the Ash Grove Communion became one more name in a grim American litany, a reminder that devotion, when twisted by the wrong hands, can turn holy fire into hellfire. And for every investigator who stood among those ashes, one question lingered, impossible to shake. If faith can lead the lost into the light, who leads the faithful when the light itself goes dark? From greed to faith gone wrong, these stories reveal how power can twist even the most sacred vows. Which of these cases shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments below, and stay with us as we uncover more chilling tales of preachers who cross the line from the pulpit to prison.